A silk dress can hide a wire, a wine glass can hide a camera, and a woman that no one looks at twice can hear everything. Beatrice Lamb had learned that truth the hard way, over 4 years of carrying plates through the dining room of Castello, the most expensive restaurant in Chicago that no one who mattered ever admitted to visiting. She was invisible there. Not in the way pretty women are invisible when they try too hard. Not in the way that gets noticed. Invisible in the way that heavy women in sensible shoes and black uniforms become part of the furniture. The chandeliers drew the eye. The flower arrangements drew the eye. The men in tailored suits with their polished watches and their low voices drew the eye. Beatrice drew nothing. She moved between tables like a shadow that had learned to carry a tray without spilling, and the world of Castello folded itself around her absence like water closing over a stone. She didn't mind, or she had told herself she didn't mind for long enough that the distinction had stopped mattering. What she did mind, what had kept her at Castello past the point where any sensible woman would have walked, was that she was extraordinarily good at her job, and her job, the real one, the one that only 2 people in the building knew about, had nothing to do with food. Beatrice Lamb had a degree in forensic accounting from Northwestern that she had never once mentioned to anyone at Castello. She had a particular gift for finding the things that numbers were trying to hide. And 6 months ago, a man named Gerald Hopper, from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, had sat across from her in a diner on Wacker Drive, and told her that Castello's reservation system ran a secondary ledger that laundered somewhere between $3 and $5 million a month, and would she be willing to spend 1 year working as a server while he built a case? She had said yes. She had said yes for reasons that had nothing to do with patriotism and everything to do with a younger brother who had borrowed money from the wrong people, and a conversation she'd had with a federal agent about prosecutorial discretion, and the way that conversation had ended with a handshake and a folder of documents she had never shown anyone. So she carried plates. So she memorized faces. She kept her eyes down and her ears open, and she sent Gerald Hopper weekly reports that she typed in a notes app and deleted after sending, and she waited. The man who owned Castello, who owned the secondary ledger and the reservation system, and probably half the aldermen in Cook County, was named Ronan Seville. She had seen him exactly twice before the night everything changed. The first time, he had been standing at the bar talking to the head of the city's zoning board, and Beatrice had passed close enough to catch his profile. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the kind of stillness that didn't come from patience but from control, from a man who had decided long ago that restlessness was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was handsome in the way that dangerous things are handsome, not inviting but arresting. The kind of face you remembered whether you wanted to or not. The second time, he had been sitting at the corner table, his table, the one that was never listed in the reservation system but was always set regardless, and he had looked up as Beatrice passed with a tray of water glasses and held her gaze for exactly 1 second, not with interest, with that particular stillness again, the same quality of attention a chess player gives a piece he hasn't decided what to do with yet. She had looked away first. She always looked away first. The third time she saw Ronan Seville, she overheard the conversation that was going to get him killed. It was a Thursday, 11:40 at night. Castello closed at 11 on weekdays, but closing time at a restaurant was a fiction observed only by the customers. Beatrice was in the corridor that ran behind the private dining rooms, the one the kitchen staff used to shuttle dishes back and forth without crossing the main floor. She was carrying a bin of used linens toward the service elevator. The music from the bar had gone quiet. The last of the front-of-house staff had clocked out 40 minutes ago. She heard voices through the wall of the third private room. Salon Tre, the one with the frosted glass panel and the soundproofing that worked well enough to muffle conversation, but not well enough to eliminate it entirely. She would not have stopped. She had stopped before in those 4 years, and heard things she wrote up in her weekly reports and sent to Gerald, and stopping was automatic now, the way reflexes become automatic when you practice them long enough. But then she heard a name she recognized. Not Seville's, not anyone from Castello. She heard the name of her brother's loan shark. The voice said, "Prescott's already talked to 2 of Seville's distributors. By the time Ronan figures out what's happening at the port, it'll be done. The accounts will be flagged, the product will be gone, and Seville will be looking at a federal freeze on every asset he can't explain." A second voice. Lower, familiar, in the way that things are familiar when you've heard them without knowing it, said, "And the woman?" A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. "Which one?" "The one he's been seeing." "The one he's been—" "Carla. Carla's the one who made the call to Prescott. She's been feeding him information for 6 weeks. The port schedule, the distribution contacts, the secondary accounts." A sound that might have been a short, humorless laugh. "She's the one who suggested the federal flag. She knows which agencies he's already managed and which ones he hasn't." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had weight. "He doesn't know. He doesn't know." Beatrice stood in the corridor with the linen bin in her arms and did not move. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she rarely was. Not racing, not panicked, but very present, very loud, like a clock in a quiet room. She thought about Gerald Hopper. She thought about the folder she'd signed. She thought about the fact that a federal asset freeze on Castello's accounts would crater the case Gerald had spent 14 months building, because a panicked seizure, without the evidentiary structure he'd assembled, would result in nothing. No convictions, no cooperation agreements, no upstream targets. It would result in the loan shark who held her brother's debt walking away clean, because the loan shark was one of Gerald's upstream targets, and without Seville there was no path to him. She thought about all of that in approximately 4 seconds. Then she thought about the man with the still dark eyes, and the corner table, and the woman named Carla, who had been feeding his enemies everything they needed to destroy him. She set the linen bin down against the wall and stood in the corridor for another 3 seconds, which felt like a very long time. Then she walked back toward the kitchen, found a notepad on the expediting counter, the kind the kitchen staff used for table modifications, small and white and completely ordinary, and she wrote 8 words in the clearest printing she had ever produced. "Carla is working for Prescott. Tonight." The port. She folded the paper once. The corner table was empty. The main floor was empty. The bar was dark. But the light under the door of the restaurant's office was still on, because Ronan Seville was one of those men who worked late, in the way that men who trust no one work late. Personally, in silence, with the door closed. Beatrice Lamb stood outside the office door for 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than she'd stood anywhere that night. Then she knocked once, slid the note under the door, and walked to the staff exit as fast as she could without running. She did not look back. She did not look back in the cab home either, or while she typed her report to Gerald, abbreviated, careful, omitting the note, or while she lay in her apartment on the north side, listening to the rain and waiting to find out whether she had just made the worst decision of her professional life, or simply the strangest. She found out the next morning. Not from Gerald. Not from the news. She found out because when she arrived at Castello for the lunch service, the hostess, a woman named Tara who had worked there 3 years longer than Beatrice and knew every ripple in the building's weather before it became a wave, looked up from the podium and said, very quietly, "Carla Voss was picked up by police at O'Hare at 6 this morning. Attempted flight. They're not saying what the charge is yet." Beatrice put on her apron and went to check the side station. She thought, 8 words. She thought, it worked. She did not think about Ronan Seville. She tried not to think about Ronan Seville. She failed. He had the note. She knew he had the note because nothing in the building was different, except that everything was different in the way that things are different when the temperature drops 3 degrees. Imperceptible unless you were already paying attention, and Beatrice was always already paying attention. The corner table was set, as it always was. The frosted glass panel on salon tray was closed as it always was. The staff moved through their opening checklist as they always did. But there were 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the service entrance, not eating, not waiting for a table. And when she passed them with a water pitcher, they both tracked her without turning their heads, the way trained men do. She did not look at them directly. She catalogued them in peripheral vision, the way she catalogued everything: height, build, the slight asymmetry in the jacket of the one on the left that suggested a shoulder holster. She thought, he's looking for who sent the note. She thought, I used the kitchen notepad. They'll find the notepad. The handwriting will be on it. She thought, I should have used my own paper. She thought all of this between the service entrance and the 3rd table in the center section, where she set down 4 glasses of water and recited the day's specials without a single stumble, because 4 years of practice had made the recitation as automatic as breathing, and she could run a parallel processes. The lunch service was unremarkable. The lunch service was unremarkable. She did not see She did not see the 2 men by the service entrance again. She ate her staff meal in the kitchen, standing up, and changed her apron for the dinner service, and told herself that the worst possible outcome was that she'd be fired, and being fired was survivable. She knew, even as she thought it, that it wasn't true. The worst possible outcome was considerably worse than being fired. She was aware of this in the same steady, dissociated way. She was aware of most unpleasant facts, clinically, at a slight remove, the way a doctor is aware of a diagnosis before they've decided how to communicate it. Dinner service started at 5:30. At 6:47, the corner table's reservation appeared in the system for the first time in the 4 years Beatrice had worked there. The hostess, not Tara this time, but the evening hostess, a young woman named Ashley who had been working at Costello for 3 months and did not yet know what the corner table meant, flagged the reservation and asked Beatrice to confirm the section assignment. Beatrice confirmed it. She took the corner table's service herself. He arrived at 7:15. He was alone. He was wearing charcoal grey instead of the black she'd seen him in before, and the difference registered somewhere at the back of her mind as meaningful in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. The grey was more deliberate somehow, more intentional. He sat down without looking at the menu. Beatrice approached from the left, as she always did, tray resting on her forearm. She had been doing this for 4 years. She had been doing this for 4 years. She was very good at it. Good evening, she said. Can I start you with still or sparkling? Ronan Seville looked up, the second time he'd looked at her. In that corridor, the brief moment at the corner table, she had looked away. She didn't look away now. She wasn't sure why. Some decisions made themselves. Still, he said, and then, without any particular inflection, you've been working here 4 years. It was not a question. Yes, she said. Thursday evenings, among others. He looked at her the way he had looked at the chessboard in his mind, that first time she'd noticed him, that quality of attention that assessed without performing assessment. She had the sudden, very clear understanding that he already knew, that the 2 men by the service entrance had done their job, and the kitchen notepad had been found, and the handwriting had been matched to her shift records, or her employment file, or something she hadn't thought of, and he already knew. She kept her face exactly where it was. She had not spent 4 years becoming invisible to flinch now. I'll have the branzino, he said, and I'd like you to sit down when the section clears, she said. I'll put the order in. She did not sit down when the section cleared, because the section did not clear. A 4-top came in at 8, and then a deuce, and then the bar filled up with the late crowd, and she used the business of the service to organize her thoughts into something she could work with. He knew. He was not angry, or if he was angry, he had decided to express it as dinner, and a request for her to sit down, which was either a significantly better outcome than she'd feared or a significantly more complicated one. She thought about Gerald Hopper. She thought about the 14-month case. She thought about the fact that Ronan Seville was the subject of that case, and that she had just, by any reasonable interpretation, warned him about an operation run by a man who was one of Gerald's targets in a way that might have compromised the investigation she'd been placed to protect. She thought, I should call Gerald, she thought. I should have called Gerald last night. She brought Ronan Seville his branzino at 8:22. He ate it without looking at his phone, which was an unusual enough behavior in the clientele of Castello that she noticed it. He ate slowly, the way people eat when they're using the meal to think. At 9:15, when the section had thinned to 2 tables, both deep in dessert and conversation, he looked up at her and said, "Now." She brought a glass of water for herself, because it gave her hands something to do, and she sat down across from him in the corner table, in the chair that was never listed in the reservation system. And Ronan Seville looked at her across the white linen and said, 8 words. It was what fit on the paper, she said. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile. You weren't afraid. She thought about answering that honestly, and decided honesty was the correct strategy. I was afraid. I left anyway. Why? Because the alternative was knowing I'd heard it and done nothing. He was quiet for a moment. The ambient noise of the restaurant, low music, the clink of glassware, the murmur of conversations being conducted in careful undertones, wrapped itself around the table like a curtain. You have a Northwestern degree, he said. Forensic accounting. She had known it was coming. She did not react. You've done your research. I do research on everyone who works for me. It took my people longer than it should have to find yours, because you'd buried it well. Community college transcripts on file here. Transfer records that don't transfer anywhere traceable on first pass. He tilted his head slightly. That's not something a woman hiding her education does. That's something a woman who knows how to construct a plausible paper trail does. She held his gaze and said nothing. Who sent you? He said. It was not an accusation. It was the same tone he might have used to ask who prepared the fish. She said, If I answer that, what happens? I'd like to know what the right answer is to that question before I give it to you. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Nothing happens to you. That's the answer. She believed him, which surprised her. And she thought about the fact that she believed him, and she thought about Gerald Hopper and 14 months and her brother and the loan shark. And she said, Federal Financial Crimes Unit. I've been here a year. He nodded. Once, the way you nod when something confirms a thing you'd already reasoned out. The secondary ledger. Yes, and you warned me anyway. The operation at the port would have triggered an asset freeze. A freeze at this stage would have collapsed the case. She paused. The case reaches further than Castello. To people I have a personal interest in seeing prosecuted. The loan shark, he said. She looked at him. He had done thorough research. My brother made a mistake, she said. It cost him. I'm trying to make it cost less. Ronan Seville sat back in his chair and looked at her as if she were a problem he had not anticipated and was finding considerably more interesting than the problems he had anticipated. The restaurant had gone quieter around them. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone was running the dishwasher. You warned the man you were sent to investigate, he said. Because prosecuting me is the vehicle through which you get to someone who hurt your family. Yes, that's a very long game. I'm good at long games. He looked at her hands, both flat on the table, still no fidgeting. Yes, he said. I can see that, she thought. This is the part where it goes wrong. This is the part where the stillness breaks and the thing under it emerges, and I find out what I've actually done. he said. I want to make you an offer, she said. I'm listening. My accountant has been with me for 11 years. He's retiring at the end of the quarter. I've been looking for someone with his particular skill set for 3 months and found nothing I can trust. He paused. I trust you. She stared at him. I just told you I work for the federal government. You told me you work for the federal government in service of a case against someone who hurt your family. That's a different thing. He picked up his water glass. The man you want, the loan shark, his name is Darren Moss. He's been running a debt collection operation using 3 shell companies that pass money through a holding company in Delaware. I have the account numbers, the routing information, and the names of 4 lawyers who facilitate the transfers. He set the glass down. I've never used it because I've never needed it. It would take someone with your background approximately 2 weeks to build a case that would satisfy any federal prosecutor in this district. She could not feel her hands. She was aware of this distantly, the way you're aware of cold before it becomes pain. Why? She said. Because you walked to that door last night and slid a piece of paper under it when you didn't have to. Because you sat down at this table tonight and told me the truth when you didn't have to. He looked at her steadily. And because I want someone in that office who understands the difference between what the numbers say and what the numbers mean. There are very few people in the world who can do that. She said, I can't work for you and work for Gerald Hopper. No, he said, you can't. The music shifted. Someone at the bar laughed at something. Beatrice Lamb sat in the corner table in Castello and looked at the man across the linen and thought about every choice that had led to this one, and what they had cost, and what this one would cost, and whether the math resolved Gerald's case, she said. If I came to work for you, what happens to it? It continues. I have no interest in obstructing a federal investigation. A slight pause. I have considerable interest in not being the primary subject of one. There are terms under which that becomes possible, she said. With appropriate protections and appropriate targets, yes. He looked at her evenly. I have been waiting for someone worth cooperating with. The agents they've sent to approach me previously were not worth cooperating with. She thought, Gerald is going to have opinions about this. She thought, Gerald is going to be furious, she thought. Gerald is going to get cooperation he wanted, plus a going cooperation agreement, and he is going to be furious anywhere, and that's a problem for later. I need 48 hours, she said. Take 72, he said. And when you come back, he said it. When, not if. And she noticed. And she thought he intended her to notice. I'll have the Moss files ready. She stood up. She picked up her water glass and her tray. She was halfway back to the service station when she heard him say, quietly, from the corner table, What's your name? Beatrice Lamb. She turned. Beatrice Lamb, she said. He repeated it once, as if he was deciding what to do with it. The way he'd looked at her the first time, that chess player's attention, assessing without performing assessment. Beatrice, he said. That's a name for someone who doesn't disappear. She thought about 4 years of carrying plates and being furniture. She thought about the Northwestern degree buried under community college transcript. She thought about her brother and Darren Moss and Gerald Hopper and 14 months and a piece of paper with 8 words on it, slid under a door in the dark. She said, No, it isn't. She turned and walked back to the service station, and she did not look back, and this time she meant it because there was nothing behind her worth looking back at, only the thing that was ending, the 4 years of invisibility and careful silence, the tray and the apron, and the woman who had learned to be furniture and had done it so well that she'd almost believed it herself. What was ahead of her was different. What was ahead of her was the 72 hours and the Moss files and the call to Gerald that was going to be the most difficult professional conversation of her career. What was ahead of her was a corner office in a building she'd never been in, and a set of books that would tell her things in the language she'd always been best at, and the man with the still dark eyes who had said when, instead of if and who looked at her, the way no one in 4 years at Castello had looked at her, as though she were the most interesting thing in the room. She had spent 4 years making herself invisible. It turned out the whole time he had seen her anyway. Gerald Hopper called her at 8 the next morning. She let it ring twice, then picked up. "I heard about Carla Voss," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "You want to tell me how she got picked up at O'Hare?" She said. "I want to meet. Today, if you can do it. There are some developments I need to walk you through in person." Another pause, longer. Gerald was a careful man. He heard what she wasn't saying, which was one of the reasons she had agreed to work with him in the first place. How significant are these developments? She looked out her apartment window at the grey Chicago morning, the lake invisible behind the low clouds, the city going about its business in the particular way it went about its business. Dense, purposeful, slightly dangerous, indifferent to individuals while being built entirely from them. "You're going to want to bring someone from the cooperation unit," she said. "And Gerald? This is going to go better than you planned. I need you to be ready for that." She heard him breathe. "Beatrice," he said, "what did you do?" She thought about 8 words on a piece of paper. She thought about a corner table and a still-eyed man who had said when. She thought about Darren Moss and routing numbers in Delaware and the particular way a ledger looks when someone who knows what they're doing has tried to hide something and hasn't quite succeeded. "My job," she said, "just from a different angle than we discussed." She hung up. She looked at the lake she couldn't see. She thought about 72 hours and what came after. For the first time in 4 years, Beatrice Lamb felt like the most visible person in the room, even alone in her apartment with no one watching. Especially then.